The Spectator is a journal that I read every week and enjoy for the quality of the writing. They also have a podcast, and I was very pleased when they invited me to have a conversation with Charles Moore, former editor of the magazine, about P.G. Wodehouse. Wodehouse is perhaps my favourite writer. I have a huge collection of his novels, and I reread them incessantly. I recently listened to Stephen Fry's magnificent audiobooks of Jeeves stories and Blanding stories, and can't recommend his readings highly enough. His voice is perfect for these stories, and he has the born actor's ability to become each character in an unobtrusive way. Unfortunately, I can't recommend the TV dramatizations in which he played Jeeves. Nothing wrong with the acting, but the scripts were awful travesties, distorted manglings of the original. What on earth gave some tin-pot scriptwriter the idea that he could improve on P.G. Wodehouse? Charles Moore agreed, and made a comparison to the Americans, who had the temerity to attempt a remake of The Lady Killers, one of the greatest ever film comedies. Charles Moore and I also saw eye to eye in our admiration for Wodehouse, and we had what I found an enjoyable conversation. I hope you agree.
In the Christmas magazine this year, Charles Moore discusses the Divine Comedy of P.G. Wodehouse, and he takes a closer look at some of the various literary and biblical references contained within the Code of the Worcesters. To talk further about P.G. Wodehouse, Charles joins me now alongside the evolutionary biologist and author Richard Dawkins, who is also a big P.G. Wodehouse fan. So Charles, first of all, could you start by telling us a little bit about your own affection for Wodehouse and perhaps when you remember first reading him?
I think I first read Wodehouse at prep school. I expect I was 9 or 10. He was pretty popular with the boys then. And what I loved immediately was, I think, what I love still, which is the verbal dexterity, the wit, and the creation of a perfectly formed world. But there's a sub-point there, which is that it was also sort of familiar, and that goes to a lot of the way the jokes are made and the literary references, because they were very much the literary and biblical references of the education at the time. And so I felt as you entered this perfectly formed world, you sort of knew it already. And yes, it was paradise. It wasn't a real world, of course.
And do you think a certain type of education is therefore essential to understanding P.G. Wodehouse?
I think it does help. I think Wodehouse is intrinsically funny at many levels, but part of the joke and part of the verbal skill is his brilliant mixture, which these references encapsulate, between the sort of colloquial and deliberately stupid language of Bertie Wooster in particular, and the grand literary and biblical traditions with which his readers were familiar. So it's the clash between those two forms of diction, those two ways of talking, which is highly comic.
Richard, you are also a huge fan of P.G. Wodehouse. Do you remember when you first read his works?
I remember very well, yes. I was at prep school, and the headmaster came in and sat on somebody's bed, and he noticed a book on a bookshelf in the dormitory. He picked it up and said, "Do you boys love Jeeves?" And we said, "We don't know. We never heard of him." So he read us a story. It was The Great Sermon Handicap.
Ah, yes.
Absolutely enchanted. This was the story about how Bertie and a lot of his young friends were marooned in the country reading for an exam with the local vicar. And they placed bets on which of the local vicars would preach the longest sermon on a particular Sunday. And all the sort of horse racing jargon that they used was just wonderful, about nobbling the favourite and coughing in his stable all night and that kind of thing. So that was my first introduction. And I immediately set about reading. Well, I read about just about everything, certainly all of Jeeves and certainly all of Blandings. And I absolutely adore it. I agree with what Charles Moore has said about the juxtaposition of Bertie's language and Jeeves's more cultivated language. I'm particularly captivated by the metaphors, which are extreme in a kind of ridiculous way. He looked like a man who, stooping to pluck a nosegay of wild flowers on a railway line, is struck in the small of the back by the Cornish Express. A family row, when aunt calls to aunt like mastodons bellowing across the primeval swamp. There's a kind of exaggeration there, which is just perfect. It was one of those still evenings you get in the summer when you can hear a snail clear its throat a mile away. All that kind of thing, hyperbole in the metaphors, which makes them extremely funny.
Also, the similar thing, but it comes in with the literary comparison in particular, which Bertie often attributes to Jeeves, though in fact it's Shakespeare or whatever.
Yeah.
So, for example, it says, "Full many a glorious morning have I seen scatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye and turn into a rather nasty afternoon." That's the sort of that's the way it works. That's the way the joke works, and very effective it is. But you do have to pick up the reference at least a bit. You may not actually quite be able to source it in your mind, but you need to hear that literary or biblical echo for the full humour to work.
Yes, one of Jeeves's little things. It's wonderful.
Yes, one of Jesus' little things. And I don't know if you agree, Richard, but I think the familiarity with the world, even though Wodehouse's world is fantastical. So, for example, you mentioned the great sermon handicap. We boys of that generation would have been familiar with boring sermons, which we were compelled to hear, and their character. And similarly, another thing that happens quite often in the stories is that Bertie or someone, Gussie, has to address a prize giving at a school. And that, of course, is also a thing we were very familiar with, those sort of very formal prize givings. And one time Bertie has to address a prize giving, and he absolutely can't think, girls' school, I think, and he absolutely can't think of anything to say. And he says, "Did you know the amazing fact that if you stand opposite Romano's in the Strand, you can see the clock on the law courts?" And I actually tested this once because Romano's in the Strand is what is now Stanley Gibbons, the stamp seller. And I stood exactly in where I was told to by Bertie, and it's absolutely true. And it is remarkable because you have to look past St Mary's in the Strand and I think St Clement Danes in order to see the law clock, but you can. The law court clock, but you can.
Similar one where Monty Bodkin is editing. He's deputy editor of Tiny Tots.
Yeah. Yes.
And he says something like, you can win a lot of money by betting somebody that a bottle of whiskey holds more than whatever it's supposed to, and you fill the bottle and then you turn it over and fill the indentation at the bottom with whiskey. Of course, he gets the slack for this. Much the same as Bertie's address to the girls' school. That one you quote, by the way, is the only time when Jeeves does the narrating.
Ah, yes, I'd forgotten that.
You're not told at the beginning that it's Jeeves. You have to catch on to the fact that it's Jeeves doing the narrating rather than Bertie.
You're quite right. And it's a brilliant device that Bertie does do the narrating because because he's stupid, but actually he's not. Because he couldn't narrate it like that if he were.
No, quite.
And this also interests me in terms of his literary and biblical references because they are in his culture. He jumbles them and can't remember them and attributes them to properly and attributes them to Jeeves. But actually they are in his mind all the time, aren't they? They are echoing in his mind and they do help to form his expression. It's very cleverly done.
Yes, it is. He's not as stupid as
And Richard, one of the points that Charles makes is that this type of humour that relies heavily on literary references is slightly at risk of dying out these days. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes. I mean, it is a bygone era, and I suppose it's probably true that I'm not sure whether young people will take the allusions that you have to take in order to appreciate it. What do you think, Charles? I mean,
I think it is a problem, yes. I think he's still very enjoyable because the verbal dexterity is apparent to any reader and the absurdity of the situations is apparent. But that particular type of joke does require picking up some reference, and young people will tend not to because they're, I would say, to be brutal, less well educated. And there's something else there too, which I think that humour is much less concerned with verbal wit than it used to be. And therefore the whole idea of these type of jokes is actually rather out. And what you see now in most comedy is often sort of people shouting at one another or stand-ups shouting. And there's a sort of extremity of humour rather than something more careful and exact. So I often notice verbal jokes, not just literary references, but clever verbal jokes in general, often missed by audiences now. It can be quite slow in a theatre. And it would not have been at one stage. It happens, I've noticed, for example, with Noel Coward would be another example.
Yes, you could be right. I hadn't thought of it like that. I mean, there are some things which I think anybody could take, like Honoria Glossop is one of those robust, dynamic girls with the muscles of a welterweight and a laugh like a squadron of cavalry charging over a tin bridge.
Yes, that would pass. Though probably someone would object to the objectification of Honoria Glossop.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And Richard, you yourself have actually tried writing a few Wodehouse parodies. How was that, and was it a daunting prospect trying to do so?
Surprisingly not, actually. I found it quite easy. I hope I did it all right. I did send it to Stephen Fry, and he seemed to appreciate it. He's of course a great Wodehouse aficionado and actor.
Just on as an impartial observer, I do think Richard's two stories are brilliantly well done because he's tackling big subjects. One's the existence of God, and the other is the theory of evolution, and indeed there's a relation between the two. And it's superbly done with, of course, Jeeves expounding. But as in the originals, Bertie is this funny mixture that I've described of being stupid and clever. So actually he does pick up a lot of Jeeves's argument about the origin of species and other important and profound matters, doesn't he? It's very good.
It's kind of you to say so. Thank you. I think they're both reprinted in one of my books. I forget which, probably Science in the Soul. But what about the television adaptations?
I haven't seen by any means all of them. When I was a boy, it was Ian Carmichael and Dennis Price.
I love that.
And I thought it was tremendously good. Of course, I was only a boy, so maybe I'm missing something, but I thought they got both characters extremely well. And then I suppose the dominant one of more modern times was Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie. And though I admire both those actors, I actually thought that was a little bit less successful. I felt that it might have been Stephen Fry, actually, as Jeeves, was a little too heavy or slow or something. I think you need... Obviously, Jeeves is sort of pompous because he uses perfect expression all the time. But to my mind, he should be a bit more of a sort of light-footed dancer than Stephen Fry was. And I somehow didn't quite... I mean, it certainly wasn't bad, and it was done by two men who clearly loved the subject, so that was very good.
I disagree about that. I think Stephen Fry's Jeeves is very good. And what I didn't like about that production was the way they messed around with the stories.
Yes.
And that was truly annoying because nobody can do it better than P.G. Wodehouse, and they stuck in all sorts of other stuff, which cross-dressing and things which are not in the books and which I found greatly irritating.
It's a great feature of television and film that it can't leave well alone. I mean, it sometimes can't even leave well alone in its own genre. So, for example, there's an absolutely perfect healing comedy, The Lady Killers, which was remade quite recently. Why on earth would you do that? It wouldn't...
I actually haven't I refuse to see the remake. But I tell you what's a very good production of P.G. Wodehouse is the Pauline Collins, John Alderton version of the Mulliner stories.
You're quite right. I'd completely forgotten about that. I did see those many, many years ago. When was that? In the 80s or something?
Not sure when it was, but they are wonderful. I mean, both the actors are terrific. Pauline Collins as various 1920s flappers is superb, and John Alderton as various silly young men of the sort of Pongo Twistleton type, and they're beautifully done, and the stories are completely faithful to the original. The Mulliners of Hollywood, for example, where there's an escaped gorilla, and the Mulliner compliments him on his English, and he says, "Oh well, Balliol, you know." And then there's another one where the Mulliner is a nodder. His job is to attend editorial meetings with the big boss, and when the big boss says something, all the yes men have to say yes, and then all the nodders have to nod.
Well, that really exists, of course. Yes.
Yeah. And just to finish, can I ask you both for your favourite P.G. Wodehouse novel, if that's not too difficult a question? Richard, what would be your pick if you could just choose one?
Uncle Fred in the Springtime, which is one of the Blanding stories with this wonderful character, the Earl of Ickenham. And it's a superb plot. It involves Sir Roderick Glossop. It involves imposters, all the usual Blandings things. I think there are so many, but I keep coming back to that as my very favourite. But it's a very hard choice to make.
I think it would be the Code of the Worcesters, which is the one I've used to study the literary references in this Christmas Spectator,
yes.
Because it has the complete mastery of plot and humour that all the best ones do. But it adds something, I think, because very gently it also contains politics, which is something that Wodehouse rightly shied away from. But the great Roderick Spode of the Black Shorts is a superb character, and it is actually much the best way of laughing at looking at British fascism, which never was, I mean, it was seriously nasty, but it never was serious, if you know what I mean. It never got anywhere. And I think it's just absolutely perfectly done in by Wodehouse, and it's really him at the height of his sort of early maturity. And it just comes to the most perfect end, in which, having started on the first page with a mangling of a Shakespearean quotation, Bertie goes to sleep by mangling another one about sleep being knitting up the raveled sleeve of care.
Yes, that Oswald Mosley's parody is it gives the lie to the awful calumny of Wodehouse being a Hitler sympathizer, which
yes, I mean, poor old Wodehouse just messed that up, didn't he? Because he gave that broadcast when he was held as a prisoner by the Germans, and that was considered to be a sort of extenuation of them in some way. It clearly wasn't. It was, but he didn't really understand the situation he was in, and he was made to pay a very, very high price for it. Yeah.
Well, Richard and Charles, thank you very much for joining.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.